Hi, I'm Dave Sleet, and this is a Sleet Report. Now, what do you think a mighty warrior would be like? Probably someone tall and strong, with big muscles and big courage. The sort of person that everyone listens to and everybody wants to be their friend. The sort of person who's afraid of nothing. A bit like a Superman. A bit like me, really. Oh, okay, not like me. But, anyway, that is the sort of person that Gideon wasn't. And yet, when the angel of the Lord went to see him, it's what he called him. "God is with you, mighty warrior," he said, which was probably a bit of surprise to Gideon. That and an angel turning up, which doesn't happen every day. For one thing, at the time, Gideon was hiding underground in a wine press so his enemies wouldn't see him and steal his food. Gideon didn't look much like a mighty warrior. He looked more like a scaredy cat. So, would it surprise you to know that Gideon was the next rescuer God was sending to rescue his people? Well, it surprised Gideon. He didn't think of himself as a rescuing type. But here's the key. He would be able to do it because God would help him. That's what God said when Gideon pointed out that he was a nobody. God said, "You can do it because I will help you." Who cares if Gideon was the least important person in his family? And his family were weaker than anyone else around. God was strong. God was the ultimate somebody. God would help him. You can't argue with that now, can you? Well, maybe not, but that didn't stop Gideon trying. So, here is Gideon's plan for getting out of scary things I don't want to do. Step 1. Make God prove that he really is who he says he is. Now, God was very clear that it was him who was talking to Gideon. But even Gideon couldn't question it anymore after God's angel made the food Gideon had prepared burn up in a fire that came from nowhere. And then the angel vanished into thin air, just to make it even clearer. So, step 2. If you have to do a scary thing, do it in the middle of the night so that no one else will see what you're up to. Now, the Israelites, including Gideon's dad, had been worshipping an idol made of wood instead of God. So the first thing that God wanted Gideon to do was destroy the idol. After all, God's people should be worshipping God, not a lump of wood. But being told that God was with him didn't stop Gideon being scared of his dad and how the others would react. So he did it in the dark, in secret. Hiding again. Typical Gideon. Step 3. Check with God that he's absolutely sure he wants you to do what he's told you he wants you to do. Even after God had proved who he was and destroying the idol had gone well, even after God's Spirit had entered Gideon and he'd gathered an army together ready to fight, Gideon still felt he needed to check again that God really wanted him, scaredy cat Gideon, to rescue his people. I mean, God had said it, and God doesn't lie, but it's best to be sure, right? Well, it wasn't exactly necessary, but Gideon thought it needed clarifying, so Gideon did the famous fleece test. He left some wool on the ground overnight to see if God could make the wool wet and the ground dry. Then, the next night, he left it out again to see if the wool was dry and the ground was wet. And they were, because God was being very patient with Gideon and proved to him again that he really did want Gideon to rescue his people. He wasn't going to let Gideon off the hook. So, God had left Gideon with no option. He couldn't get out of it. He would have to rescue the Israelites from their enemies, the Midianites, who had been bullying them for 7 years. So, Gideon took his army of 32,000 men and camped near the Midianites, ready for the battle. But, God didn't want Gideon to think for a minute that he could win the battle on his own. It was God who was going to win his battle. And to make that completely obvious to everyone, he sent most of Gideon's army home. So, first he told everyone who was scared to go, which left about 10,000 brave men and Gideon. Then he took everyone to have a drink from the stream and sent home everyone who got onto their knees to drink, which just goes to show you can lead an Israelite to water and you can make him drink, but you might end up with a tiny army. That would be so much better if that joke would be so much better if the Israelites were from Norway. Oh well. Anyway, now there were only 300 Israelites left, which was a tiny army, particularly because there were so many Midianites you couldn't even count them. Each Israelite would be fighting against thousands of men. They were absolutely, definitely no way that they could win without God doing the winning for them. Ha! Luckily, that was the plan all along. Cowardly Gideon was doing quite well now. He had been doing what God told him to. He'd gone along with the cutting of his army without complaining about it or running away to hide. He seemed to be trusting God, but God knew him well, and so he reassured him one last time before he led them into battle. He told him that if he was scared about attacking the Midianites, he should sneak down to their camp and eavesdrop on what they were saying, and he wouldn't be scared anymore. So, that's what Gideon did. After all, this was Gideon being scared, which was what he was good at. Not that I blame him. I probably would have been a bit scared too in his shoes. So, when Gideon got to the camp, he heard a Midianite describing a dream he'd had about a loaf of bread knocking over a tent. A bit weird. But then he heard someone else say that dream could only mean one thing. God had given Gideon victory over the Midianites. Naturally. Well, not naturally, supernaturally. The only way he could have thought that is if God made him think it. But it did the trick. Gideon felt much better about everything when he heard it, so he went and got his army ready to go into battle. Now, Gideon's military strategy was odd but effective. He gave his 300 men a horn, a torch, and a jar each. They stood around the Midianite camp, blew their horns, smashed their jars, and shouted. And that's when God did his thing. He made all the Midianites run around in panic and start killing each other. Gideon called in reinforcements from other parts of Israel, and they were easily able to kill those who were left. Job done. And it couldn't be more obvious who'd done the job, which of course was the idea all along. God had done it all. He was the one who had rescued his people, those forgetful, unfaithful, rebellious people. He just didn't give up on them, even though they kept getting worse and worse. He'd rescued them yet again. And of course, this was only a small part in his big plan to rescue the world. This pattern of God's people rejecting God and being rescued and forgetting about God all over again wasn't going to go on forever. The best rescue was yet to come. One day, God was going to rescue his people once and for all. I wonder how he was going to do that. Well, through Jesus, of course, but more about that next time.